Welcome to Cardboard History. I'm David. Today I want to do another episode for my Ken Burns collection and show 5 cards that I've picked up that are part of this collection. And these 5 cards have something in common, which is why I'm doing them together. After the Strongsville show, I picked up a couple bigger cards for the Ken Burns collection, and so I wanted to maybe target some lower hanging fruit, some cheaper options of cards, but also wanted to find some cards that weren't incredibly common. I have quite a few cards from like the 70s and 80s that I know are typically just a couple bucks when they're in rare and somewhat decent condition. So since those are prevalent, I targeted something a little bit more rare, and these are 5 people that are in the documentary mentioned, but they are not directly or most commonly associated with baseball. So part of the reason for doing or including people like this in the collection that I'm working on is because I not only want to collect the history of baseball, but also connect the way that the history of baseball interconnects with the history of the world. And there's quite a few people who get mentioned throughout the documentary, not so much because they directly impact baseball, but because of the things that they do or their comments that have a larger impact on the world. And so these are 5 cards that fit into this category of people that I categorized under notable names or figures. And they're not directly connected to baseball, but yet they come up in the documentary, both the video and in the book. So I'm going to share a couple of these cards, talk about how they fit in with the history of baseball in the documentary, and a little bit of the story behind them. So let me turn the camera around here, and we'll take a look. So the first card up is this 1924 Ogden's Leader of Men, John Wesley card. John Wesley was an English minister, most notable for starting the Methodist Church and Wesleyanism. He was an itinerant preacher who had a significant impact on Christianity in early America. And the reason why he's mentioned in the documentary is because he is the namesake of Branch Rickey. Branch Rickey's name is Wesley Branch Rickey. And Rickey grew up in a Wesleyan family that also comes up. He attended Ohio Wesleyan University, where he had some pretty impactful experiences with their baseball team. So this is John Wesley. This is his first card of any kind. He lived from 1703 to 1791, and so he doesn't have any living day cards, but this is his earliest example from the 1924 Ogden Leaders of Men. Another individual that I picked up from the same set is William Shakespeare. Now, Shakespeare is one of the more obscure references in the documentary. In the video, it's mentioned about a concessionaire, Perry M. Stevens, who is credited with bringing the hot dog to baseball games. And as he would hand out sell concessions, sell scorecards and things like that, he would also entertain the crowd by quoting Shakespeare and Lord Byron. And so that's where Shakespeare comes in the early days. Hard to imagine now somebody doing concessions that would quote Shakespeare and that people would give them any notice. However, in the book, the accompanying book to the documentary, Shakespeare is not mentioned in that context, but rather in a more recent context from the 70s. In 1970, there was a player, Jim Bouton, who published a book called Ball 4. And in that book, he told the dark side of life on the road with a baseball team and some of the more immoral things that would happen as the team would travel related to drugs and women and loose living. And a lot of players and executives were not happy with Bouton for kind of publishing this tell-all exposition of life on the road. And some people disputed his claims and said that he was making things up. One player who was particularly unhappy was Pete Rose. And during games against Bouton, Ken Burns recalls that Pete Rose would yell obscenities from the dugout at Bouton and curse him out, calling him Shakespeare because he wrote a book. So not a very necessarily clever remark, but nevertheless, Shakespeare shows up both in the film documentary for his connection to the concessionaire Perry Stevens, and also with Pete Rose and his distaste for Jim Bouton. Next up is George Bernard Shaw. Shaw was a Nobel Prize winning playwright. He was also a critic and very politically active, had some controversial views around Marxism and socialism in the early 1900s. He is quoted quite a few times throughout the documentary. One of his more well-known quotes related to baseball is when he said, who is the Baby Ruth and what does she do? Showing a little bit of his ignorance and perhaps just being playful with the American sport. He was more used to cricket, but when he saw baseball, he did remark that he liked how there was more heckling from the audience or the crowd in baseball, and that he wished that similar language or similar tactics would be used in cricket to try to throw off batsmen and things of that nature. He also met John McGraw and called him the real and most authentic, most remarkable man in America. So he was quite taken with John McGraw. This card is not Mr. Shaw's first card. He does have a card from Straight Tobacco, if I can bring that up on the screen here. So this card shown here is from the Straight Tobacco caricature set, which was produced a year before this in 1926. This card from Carreras is 1927. And normally I'll try to go for an early card, the earliest card if I can, but I just really didn't care for the caricatured nature of the Straight Cut Caricatures card, and I really liked this card a lot better. I love the expression on his face and kind of his jovial nature. If you've ever seen any videos of him, he definitely talks in a very jovial nature. So that is George Bernard Shaw. Next up is John D. Rockefeller. This is a 1934 Eckstein Halbhaus, which is a German tobacco cigarette issue. And this is Rockefeller's only living days card. And he comes up in the documentary kind of as a comparison for Albert Goodwill Spaulding. Ken Burns notes that what Rockefeller was to oil, Spaulding was to the game of baseball. And so he gets connected because of his significant legacy. There's also, he also gets mentioned with Judge Landis, who becomes the first commissioner of the major leagues. And Landis certainly had a reputation as a judge. At one point, he even brought John Rockefeller into court to fine him in the Standard Oil Company. And so certainly as a judge, he held sway and was not afraid to take on powerful men in America, and that was the characteristic which really drew a lot of people in baseball towards naming him the commissioner, is that he would not be swayed by powerful people, but would make a fair and hopefully honest judgment. There's much more that can be said about Judge Landis, and I'm sure I'll talk about him at some point, but he kind of has a connection to John Rockefeller as well. Then the last and perhaps most controversial card is Fidel Castro. Castro is certainly an interesting character when it comes to his connection with athletics. This is a 1973 Panini OK VIP Fidel Castro. This was produced by Panini in Italy, and it's one of his earliest cards. I can pull up here on the screen what, according to TCDB, is his earliest card. And it's this comic book folders from A and BC. And he's not the only one on the card. We also have what looks like either President Washington or Jefferson, perhaps. But these cards over here are more comic book related, and they were trifles, so not standard card size. So I opted to go for this one instead. I like the Panini OK VIP set because it gives an early look into some people who were significant in the history of the world, and they featured them while they were still having influence and power. And so there's several cards that are in my Ken Burns collection from this set that comes from Italy. So interestingly, picking these up on eBay, this one shipped from Italy, and the Rockefeller shipped from Germany. The George Bernard Shaw shipped from England. So had some cards come internationally to pick these up because these don't show up very often in the United States. Castro has a really interesting history, and it's widely disputed. I'll defer to Orlando from A Collector's Dream to maybe have some more insight on how much is true. There's a story that at one point he tried out for the Washington Senators as a pitcher, but didn't quite have the fastball that was needed to make it in the majors. There's an article on Saber by Peter Barkman who disputes that claim that Castro was ever a good enough baseball player to warrant being scouted. But there's also quite a few other legends about him being scouted, playing against major leaguers in Cuba during Winter League and things like that. Barkman sets out to prove that all of those stories are nothing more than legends, and that when you actually dig into the history, they don't line up. Castro did play baseball in high school his senior year, but failed to make the college team when he graduated from high school. He was also an avid basketball player, which is shown on this card. He's credited by some as inventing the Euro step, which they argue should be called the Cuban step, and that could just be another part of his legend. But definitely an interesting character when it comes to his fascination with baseball and basketball and the way that he shaped Cuban leagues and Cuban baseball. So he's the last player. He's brought up because of his role in history, the documentary, and the Cuban Missile Crisis and things of that nature really shaped baseball, and he really closed the door for many Cuban players to be able to come to the major leagues, which, if you know anything about the history of Cuba and Cuban baseball, you know there's quite a few. Some of the first Latino players came from Cuba. So these are a couple of figures who are in my collection. There's a handful of people like this who were not directly involved in baseball, but because of their role in the history of the world, they somehow impacted or were adjacently connected to baseball through their influence. So they're part of this collection, and I really enjoy collecting some of these people, especially John Wesley. I'm working on my PhD in theology, so people like John Wesley have always captured my attention. Another card in this collection that's kind of a high priority for me is a Billy Sunday card, just because he was a baseball player that turned into an evangelist and had a very long ministry traveling and preaching the gospel. So I want to thank you for watching. If you're still checking along, hopefully you learned something. Hopefully these were some cards that you don't typically see on a baseball channel, but show a little bit more of the history of the world as it connects to baseball. Thank you for watching Cardboard History.